Boa tarde a todos, os presentes e quem nos assiste pelo YouTube. Em nome do Projeto Temático InCEPTE, do NUPic, do professor Maurício Pietrocola, que teve um impedimento de última hora. Eu gostaria de agradecer a presença de todos. É um prazer compartilhar esses momentos, né, de reflexão com todos os presentes, e as trocas que vem surgem depois também se mostram muito interessantes. Então, eu gostaria de também lembrar que tem um texto que acompanha esse encontro. Se depois do encontro, quem não leu, tiver algum interesse, pode encontrar o texto que está disponível no site do Projeto InCEPTE, na aba Eventos. O endereço do site é incept.ia.usp.br. Então, vamos começar. Eu vou fazer uma breve apresentação do Lorenzo e do Leandro, que são os dois convidados de hoje à tarde. Lorenzo está presencialmente no IEA, então é ele quem vai começar. Em seguida, o Leandro, que está, nesse momento, fazendo a pesquisa dele na Itália, vai apresentar também os resultados dele. Ao final dessas duas apresentações, a equipe está na sala, vocês podem se manifestar para fazer perguntas. Também é possível fazer perguntas pelo chat do YouTube, eu estarei aqui recebendo, compilando e encaminhando a elas, ou pelo endereço de e-mail iaresponde@usp.br, tá bom? Todas as interações, perguntas, comentários serão encaminhados. Se não houver tempo para fazer isso no tempo da reunião, nós faremos na sequência. Então, vamos lá. O primeiro apresentador de hoje é o Lorenzo Miani. Ele é pesquisador em ensino de física, com foco em educação para sustentabilidade e mudanças climáticas. Lorenzo é doutor pela Universidade de Bolonha, onde atualmente realiza um pós-doutorado. Possui experiência internacional em instituições como Oxford e Universidade de Helsinki. Atua na formação de professores e no desenvolvimento de materiais didáticos com ênfase em interdisciplinaridade e incerteza. É autor de publicações científicas na área e já recebeu prêmios com sua produção acadêmica. Na sequência, quem vai apresentar é o Leandro do Nascimento Silva, que é doutorando em ensino de ciências pela Universidade de São Paulo, possui graduação em licenciatura em física pela Universidade Federal do Rio Grande do Sul e mestrado em ensino de ciências, modalidade física, química e biologia pela Universidade de São Paulo. Leandro tem experiência na área de ensino de física, com ênfase em física, atuando principalmente nos seguintes temas: risco, complexidade e percepção do risco. Lorenzo, a palavra está com você.
Muito obrigado. Vou falar em inglês, so I will switch to English. Hi everybody, thank you for having me here. My name is Lorenzo Miani, as of you know. And we had just couple of slides of presentation, but I think we can maybe go just quickly through it. Leandro, if you want to say something to start. The first part, just to give an idea, this presentation will be divided in 3 parts. The first part is in between me and Leandro. We will talk about the introduction of future studies and scenario making. Then Leandro will present the first part, his study on AI, and then I will do the second study with the Italian students. So yeah, Leandro, I don't know if you want to.
Thank you, Lorenzo. As Rafaela said, I'm a PhD student in science education. And now I'm a visiting PhD student in the University of Bologna, in the same group as Lorenzo is part of, the group of Professor Oliver Levrini. But my supervisor here is Professor Julia Taskier, also in the same group of Didactics and History of Physics. Maybe Lorenzo can talk more about the group. And basically my PhD research is focused on the idea of future and risk perception and emerging technologies. My main focus is to prepare students and or professors or teachers to prepare to this new society when everything is very fast and everything, and also this technological uncertainty. So you can move on, Lorenzo.
Thank you, Leandro. And yeah, as Leandro said, we are literally working in the same office for the last 8 months, I would say, office companies. And I am a postdoc right now at the University of Bologna. And as Leandro said, with the Professor Olivia Revrini group, I did all my studies there, my bachelor, my master, and now I'm also the PhD, of course, and I'm currently doing the postdoc. The group of Bologna is quite various. They focus on different topics. Mine has been climate change in the futures-oriented science education framework. So this is also the main argument of today. So like why we need to talk about futures in science education and how we can do it. So to start this presentation, I will just briefly present how we talk about futures, not just in science or science education, but in literature, in a more open way, let's say. So usually, I think you heard of this topic, like the word of utopia. Utopias are almost shared everywhere in these days. Are being sold, are the things that we should aim for. But the very idea of what is a utopia comes from the Greek. That means ou, topos. Ou means known, topos means places, lugares. So it's a known place. Therefore, utopia had been created by Thomas More in 15th century to describe something that it doesn't exist, but we would like to aim for it. So he used it in 1516 to critique the society in which he lived, imagining a faraway world full of virtues and progress according to its thinking. Okay. Now, contrary to the utopia, some years later, they also created the concept of dystopia, and this is also quite famous. Dystopian usually is almost the same concept as utopia, but is used to describe things of our society that we don't like. So it's a known place. And usually this kind of narrative is used to represent something that would happen in the future if we continue to go along a certain path. So we know many dystopias in movies, like it's full of them. One of the first in literature comes from Jonathan Swift in 1726 in the Gulliver's Travels, where he uses this kind of narrative way of talking about his society by depicting different places that have all the bad characteristics of his present. But at the same time, there is also another way of looking at futures, that is the euchronia. That is maybe a term that is less famous than the others. And euchronias follows the same composition of utopia, but instead of place, it has the word time, chronos. Therefore, a euchronia is a place that doesn't exist, but not in space, but in time, and usually is used as a narrative to describe something that is a sort of parallel universe. Therefore, like we go back in time and we change something, and then we see what happens in the future. So it's a what-if kind of reasoning. What if, for example, like one of the most famous novel is called, I think in English is The Svastika on the Sun. That is a book from, if I'm not wrong, Philip Dick, that talks about what would have happened if the Nazis would have won the Second World War, for example. And this is a euchronia. This is something that didn't happen, but what if? You know, it's a technical exercise to explore our past, present, and futures. And scenario making somehow is really similar to this practice. It's oriented to the future, of course, but the main idea is to explore the possibilities of the futures as an open concept. To do this, we move into the main field that comes from sociology, that is called futures studies. Future studies is something that was born officially in the 50s, 60s of the last century, after the Second World War, even though there were many people that were already doing this kind of practices before this. And mostly it can be described as an interdisciplinary field involving sociologists, philosophers, historians, political scientists, psychologists, economists, but also people coming from natural sciences, technology, and engineering, basically almost all of human knowledge. And they were connecting in the exercise of imagining a possible alternative world after the Second World War. Like society reached a point that was almost close to the end of our world, we can say, after the atomic bomb. Therefore, after that moment, people started to imagine, how can we prevent a possible end of the world? How can we imagine possible worlds? So they started to build these tools that were used in order to explore the future. Now, exploring the future is something really difficult because the future ontologically doesn't exist. So what does it mean to study something that doesn't exist? It's really difficult. Now, when we study the past, in the past we have to attain to our experience, to what people wrote, to all the type of knowledge that we can have. For the present, we can base on our current reading of society with sociologists, anthropologists. But when we talk about the future, this is really difficult. It's ontologically different. Therefore, if the ontology is different, we also need an epistemology that is different. Now, what are the key ideas of the future studies field? The key ideas is that we do not teach to predict what will happen, but to anticipate what could happen. It's not work of prediction, because we cannot predict, because the future doesn't exist yet. So we teach also what if, in addition to what is and what was. We teach to imagine alternatives, so many possible, plausible, desirable futures, and we will go in detail in this during this presentation. We teach to prepare people to multiple contingencies and think contingently. So the world of possibilities, to keep an open mind. And also, we do not teach only to describe what could happen, but also to influence it. Because this is one of the most important points of future studies. Teaching not for knowledge, but teaching for action. Therefore, the main task of futures literacy is to learn how to deal with the future in order to influence the present. So it's really a policy-oriented type of practice. And the work that we've been doing in Bologna, but also here in São Paulo with the work of Mauricio and all the people that are here with you, is the idea of bringing this type of futures-oriented thinking into science education. Now, there are some details about how a scenario can be made and also some definitions, and Leandro will now talk about them.
Yeah, as Lorenzo anticipated, so scenarios is a tool used by future studies to explore, to envision those futures. So if you take a more traditional definition, for example, Shoemaker or Peter Schwartz, they say that this scenario planning or scenario is a very restricted, disciplined method for anticipating these possible futures. So, yeah, the idea is not to go blind, but actually trying to create these structure stories about how the future might unfold. So next slide, please. Okay. Yeah. So a scenario is developed in this narrative description in the form of a story, of a narrative, but they are talk about possible and plausible futures. So basically grounded on all these external forces or these uncertainties. The idea is to envision how this uncertainty would unfold in the future. So the idea is that the scenarios can be also consistent, coherent to the we can read and say, oh, this might happen in the future. So the idea is to think how this future unfolds in these variable conditions, and also to think about what needs to happen and or not to happen to reach these scenarios. So it also can be an exercise to think about what we should do as society, as, I don't know, to reach or not to reach that future that we are envisioning. So next slide, please. Yeah. So to imagine these scenarios, we have some key elements. First, we need to define what is a future oriented. So the idea is that the scenarios are talking about the future, so we need to think about the context. What we are talking about, we are not talking about the future in general, but we are, for example, talking about the future of the city of São Paulo or the future of the city of Bologna. So, yeah, so we need to talk about future. So they are all about futures. So, and the second element is this external context. So we need to understand the main focus of the scenario and the main uncertainties and also the trends, also the external events, so that we can somehow think how to act or how these trends or uncertainties would unfold in the future. So, and also the third key element, it's the idea of plausibility and possibility. So, as we say before, so we can go blind into this future. So the idea is to think about this possible, which is different from impossible, and also plausible, which is different from implausible. So, but also we can think about utopias, dystopias, and I forgot the third one. As possible. Sorry?
Uchronia.
Uchronia, exactly. So we can also think about Uchronia as possible futures. So, yeah, and the idea is to be coherent to what we, not exactly what we live today, but can be coherent with how we envision the future. So next, please.
This is already the second one.
Yeah, sorry, it's because I'm following in another in the different page. Sorry. So yeah, the idea to build scenarios is to make them in this narrative description, which is a form of a story. Yeah, that's envision, and also we can read and also see those elements that the person who wrote the narratives are stating. So yeah, and also this activity of reading, of writing and story, it also helps the users to engage in thinking about these different futures and also their implications. So the fifth element is the systematized set of scenarios. Normally, when we talk about scenarios, we are not talking about one specific scenario. We are talking about this sets of scenarios which can be normally different stories based on in the same scenario. So yeah, if these scenarios exist, so each represent a different alternative of the main story. So the idea is also to compare and also to explore this range of possible futures. So, and the last one is this comparative difference. So basically these scenarios can be different from each other, but they offering different alternative logics. So or a different story as we are present later. So we work with the scenario planning with different people, and even though they follow the same steps, they comes with different logics, different stories, different perspectives about the future, about how they envision and how they perceive those futures. So yeah, so the idea is to not focus on only one, but in different types of scenarios. You can move on.
All right. So
after reading this definition of what a scenario is, we can have different questions, both epistemological or ontological. And they revolve around these main topics. That is, can we know the future? What methods and tools? And also, how do we make decisions? So we said before that the future study is a really policy-oriented type of framework, type of approach. Therefore, it is really relevant to define what is the object of the study, the tools that we use to deal with this concept, and also how do we make decisions starting from this, no? So there are two main positions with respect to the concept of future. One is called predictive approach, and the other one is more an exploratory approach. So as for the predictive approach, like a prediction, the answer to the question, can we know the future, is yes. And usually, this type of answer is given by people that trust a lot the modeling, the study of the past as a lens to understand the future. And they usually apply this forecasting, like also in weather forecasting, like, you know, it's a forecast of something that will happen, but it's always based on things that just happened, no? It's really connected to this. And in modeling. Modeling usually is an activity where, of course, like as you all know, you take the study of the present and the past, you try to understand the main mechanisms, and then you apply these mechanisms in a sort of simulations to explore what the future could be. So basically, like in this case, to make decisions, we rely on the information that we obtain from the simulations, no? And we look at the future in terms of probability. So we run many, many simulations, like in climate change. This is one of the main aspects, like simulations became the third pillar of research after theory and practice since the 80s mostly. Where basically like we trust a lot our simulations. We trust the way in which we read our society, in which we build the mathematics behind these mechanisms, and then we study the probabilities. So how probable is a certain future? Therefore, like a future can be 60% probable, 15% probable, 2% probable, no? Now, this type of approach can be really useful for specific, let's say, aspects of our society. For example, in weather, we trust a lot our simulations, because weather is a sort of forecast, is a prediction of the future in a span of time that is really brief. So usually like from 6 hours to 1 week. is a span in which we have a lot of credibility about the knowledge we build. At the same time, we can see the concept in future studies called megatrend, that is actually connected to the second one, but it's not here, it's okay. Sorry. So like the megatrend is the concept of looking at the future in a really broad scale of time. So for example, like a megatrend is something that develops in terms of 50 years, or a century. So it's a mega trend, it's something that goes over the single generation. And in this case, we are able to use forecasting and simulations to imagine possible outcomes of our society, because these trends take a lot of time to develop. But when we have to explore our personal futures, so all the time span that is between some weeks and a century, these kind of tools are not useful. Are not useful because the uncertainties and the complexities of our society are not something that can be predicted so easily. Therefore, we need different tools. And these tools are connected to the second one, that is the explorative approach. The explorative approach answers to the first question with a no. We cannot know the future, but we can explore it. Therefore, we use different type of methods, of practices. For example, the foresight instead of forecast, game design, building of scenarios, or also exploration. These are all activities that are usually are not quantified, but mostly are they base on the quality of the analysis. Therefore, is more connected to our capability of imagining alternatives, our capability of exploring possibilities, like the uchronia, something that, what if this happens? What if this other thing happens? Therefore, we can define the foresight as a systematic participatory process of gathering information about the future and constructing medium to long-term visions aimed at informing current decisions and mobilizing joint action. So again, the main idea is to have information from the future and bring it to the present. So in that case, you could be able to shape your present. Therefore, in this case, how do we make decisions? We construct the scenarios, and the scenarios are made to understand the consequences of certain actions, which we then reverse through backcasting processes. So it's a twofold activity. First, we imagine what could happen in the future. We understand the type of future, and then we trace back from the future to the present in order to understand what are the actions that need to be made and also the mistakes that need to be avoided, if possible. This is a main table that puts like the two main practices, forecast and foresight, comparing, and Leandro will explain this a bit better.
Yeah, so this is more a summary of what we want to explain about foresight, and because also forecast is a different method for future studies, but yeah, in this context, our research context, so why we chose foresight as a method of building scenarios and not forecasting, for example. So because when we talk about forecasting, we want the main objective is to predict the single specific future outcome based on quantitative data or trends or historical extrapolation, which is looking at the past or past information and to see how these numbers evolve during time. So it's not our goal. Our goal is to explore these multiple futures and also these alternative futures. So, and also the question when we talk about these two different types of future tools, it's also very different. For example, with forecast, when For example, when Lorenzo gave the example of the weather forecast. So the idea is to think what will happen. It will be raining or not, or maybe, I don't know. But the logic of the foresight is what might happen and what we should do. What should we do? Yeah, the databases. The idea of forecasting is also using these quantitative insights or these weak signals, which are very small trends that can be relevant in the future, or the systemic drivers, which are basically drivers that are important to shape the future that we are imagining. And also the perspective, when we talk about forecasting, we are talking about a more linear way to think about the future, when the future is a continuation of the past. Instead of the foresight, which we are talking about this alternative, these multiple different futures, which are more complex, and when we think about when this future is open, uncertain, and also can be shaped depending on our actions. And the last difference is more about the agency, the role of agency. When we talk about forecasting, we are talking about more passively the idea that we just reacted to the prediction, because we don't have nothing to do when we talk about this prediction. But when we talk about the whole of agency in the foresight, we are talking about more about this activity. There's more activity agency that we can shape, we can change things, that we can reach or not reach those futures.
And all these type of differences, mostly connected to the foresight aspects, can be represented through one of the different tools that has been built in the future studies field, that specifically is called the Futures Cone. It's something that is quite one of the most famous tools built. Specifically, this is the version that was made by the people of my research group, so Olivia Levrini, Giulia Taschier, Leonardo Barelli, and all other people that were part of one of the different European projects that helped to build the futures-oriented science education framework. The first one, this is from the project IC, and then the following Fedora, and actually the Fedora's one. So what does Cone tell us is that we can imagine many different types of futures. And this is already something that is groundbreaking. So the concept that the future is not one, but there are many futures is really in contrast with the Newtonian or Laplacian view of the future, you know. So we can start from the broader part, that is the potential futures, that is not even in the image, because basically it's all the white space, and is all the potentially realizable futures, even those we do not know we can imagine. So it's a space that is even beyond our imagination. Going closer, we can move to the possible futures, that is all the futures we can imagine, even if very far from the status quo. And this answers to the question, what might happen? So the same one that Leandro shared before. Then, going closer to the center part of the cone, we move to the plausible futures, that are futures that could happen based on our current knowledge. So the answer to the question, what could happen? And these type of futures are more closer to the life that we see now, so the world that we live already. But then, like the most similar to the current situation, that is usually called the status quo, is called the probable futures, that are all the futures that have a high probability of happening. And the answer to the question, what is likely to happen? Now, what is the main task? Why do we need this tool? We need this tool because it helps us identifying where our desirable futures locates with respect to all the other ones. And the preferable or desirable futures is that class of futures that we want to happen. So usually in this society, unless like you are a really, really, really super rich mega CEO or whatever company, the future that we imagine, also for example, I focus on the climate crisis, is not the future that we want. Therefore, we want to move away from the status quo. We want to move away from the probable future. Therefore, the task is to imagine a desirable future and to understand how that desirable future can influence our present. In this image, you can see that the desirable future is in green, and from the desirable future, there is a sort of big wave that goes back in the present and informs ourselves in order to reach that specific future. Now, this is the main aim of the scenario making activity, to build possible alternative futures in order to inform our present, in order to inform our decisions. And with this, we conclude the introductory part, the theoretical part. And now I leave space for Leandro for his case study that focuses exactly on the future of AI.
Yeah, thank you, Lorenzo. So yeah, now we've finished the introduction, and now we are talking about the study case. So I start with this first study case with the future of artificial intelligence. So this is part of my doctoral thesis. This is also an ongoing case study that I'm analyzing. So maybe, I don't know, it's still very structured, but I'll try to give what we want you to understand about scenarios and how to analyze this type of data. So next slide, please. So first, so just to give research context, so we work with 16 teachers in mathematics and science, mathematics and science in general. So, and we planned an activity of scenario, most specifically the Peter Schwartz method. And also we ask the participants these teachers to write a narrative about one of the futures that they construct during the activity. So basically the Peter Schwartz scenario planning activity was divided into these 5 steps. So first we identify the focal question. The focal question is the main question that will be the scenario. So for this activity, we ask the participants what might be the future, what might be the influence of artificial intelligence in the future in the city of São Paulo over the next 30 years. So we have a very specific question because, as we said before, it's scenario planning. It's a very structured. So we need to have all the informations that participants can build these scenarios. So the second step was identifying the driving forces, which are the forces that can answer these questions. So we did this collective activity that all the participants chose and pick all the drivers that they think that might be important to the future. And the third step was to determine the scenario logic, which it's a small plot of the scenario when when the participant can make some assumptions, but also something very small, very very short. And then we have the descriptive scenario, and this is when the narrative comes, and also to describe all those principles that they wrote in the scenario logic, how they evolved, how these are important. And then the last step, which is we didn't have time to do that, but it's the next step. It is the assessment of the scenarios, and to think how the implication of the potential of the scenarios. So next slide, please. This is a more representation about those steps. So this image in the left is it's the outcome of the activity of scenario planning. So as we said before, the scenario is not normally they come with a set of scenarios. So in this activity, in this scenario planning method, the result is the set of 4 scenarios. So we asked them to choose one of the scenarios to write the narrative. So they transform this outcome in this activity, this story about the future. So next, please. So we come with these 4 narratives. So there were 4 groups of 4, and each group wrote a narrative about one of the 4 possible futures that they made. So narrative A, narrative A, it's very positive, very restorative. The idea that the main narrative forms this retrospective or this backcasting voice, where a person compare past and future, and this is saying that the person is surprised that now we can have that now they have some things and in the past they don't have. Narrative B, which is a more concerned narrative with a more speculative, a more interrogative, which are very apprehensive about future and talk about that we need to be vigilant about how artificial intelligence would evolve. Narrative C, which is very similar to narrative A, also with a retrospective voice. But the idea of narrative C is that technology would evolve in the way that people feel proud about to live in a fair, or in a very proud city. And the last one is narrative D, which is more it was a very functional narrative. Basically, it's just descriptive, like say, oh, this and this going to happen, and now where there is basically no human involved, basically, because it's more a descriptive of the description of the context, not exactly a narrative. So next slide, please. This is more highlights about how we classify these narratives as we classified. So, for example, narrative A, the text say, I'm surprised when comparing the time with the present day in which the improvement of AI has caused a revolution in our way of life. So the idea is compare all the comparison between past and future, or the present days and this imaginative future. So, for example, narrative B is more the one that's more concerned. This highlight is more thinking about how this evolution will be in 30 years from now in the city of São Paulo. Depends on much focus, willpower, and hard work, so that everything occurred in a more egalitarian and revolutionary way. So the main focus of narrative B is to think about how fast is technological development, and how we can do this, how we can do this process in a very egalitarian way. So that's why this narrative is more concerned. So narrative C, talking about the life in São Paulo of the next 30 years, basically response for the AI development. So Sergio is the character that narrative C use as a protagonist. It's a proud resident of the city of São Paulo when people live in a fair, safe, and environmentally responsible manner. So it's talking about how this regulated AI managed to create this world, this scenario where people live in a fair way. And narrative D, with the more descriptive, is talking about more about this technological development is no longer a utopia and now parties of everyone's daily life. So as I said, so narrative D is a more description, but they talk about this technological development for everyone, for every day, for part of everyone's life. So next, please. But when we, even though these scenarios are very different, these four scenarios are very different, we can say that when we analyze more closely, we see that they basically talk about these two types of configurations. One, it's a more restorative, more positive, and the other one is more critical, more dystopian. So, and basically when we did the analysis, that actually I'm still doing the analysis of this data. So we see that there are these common topics that is basically the role of the state. So when we talk about this restorative reconfiguration, this configuration, the role of the state, this positive configuration, the role of the state normally it's a more active mediator. So the state regulated the AI, or the state use AI for resolve this crisis, or normally it's a more active state. And in the critical or this dystopian configuration, normally the role of the state it's more lacking. Normally, they lack of support, or the policies are normally failed. So this is very polarized. There is no none of the scenarios thought a different role for the state. So the idea of accessibility also is common in all four of the narratives. The idea that in this positive configuration that the accessibility is universal or socially distributed, and in the critical, the dystopian configuration, they talk about more about exclusion or inequality. Yeah, and they talk about all these topics in different ways, but the idea is to think that these two that there is no other there is no different configuration between these two. So this is one of our main attention points. That yeah, and also they are related to a more hegemonic way to see society. So, for example, none of the narratives thought about a future where, for example, there is no necessity of working, for example, or I don't know, a different way to understand, or to, I don't know, a different way that AI can manifest. So next slide, please. So that's why we talk about how they imagine the function of the AI. So narrative A, it's more about this instrumental or corrective nature of the AI. So AI for narrative A, it's more about this well-being operational system. So AI, narrative A is talking about AI in the sense of how they improved the way of life, and how they improved, for example, public policies, and how the state used them to, for example, control carbon emissions. So the idea is that the AI is to maintain the order and to ensure the stability of society. Narrative B, it's more about the catalysm of the uncertainty. So AI in these narratives function as a more dystopian, and also is a force that we have to resist. So because it reveals some structural flaws. So sorry. In this narrative, they say that that's the technological development somehow, if we don't follow the technological development, so somehow it will increase the instability or increase social inequality. So in narrative C, it's more about this essential public service. It's very similar to narrative A, but in this case, the idea is that AI, if regulated, they will be a source of trust, to security, and also to collective consensus. It's the idea of being a proud citizen, because AI in this context is giving more trust. So AI is giving more security to people. So for for example, people can't, there is some filters for fake news, or and also filters to ensure that people will live in a more secure way. And the last one is narrative D. It's about this infrastructure that AI is omnipresent. So AI is everywhere. So people use to diagnosis, to the learning system, and also to different ways. And the idea is that AI in this scenario is more naturalized and also invisible. And the idea of the scenario and the function of the AI is to have this technological balance between technological progress and social development. So just for me to finish, next slide, please. Okay, just give you some conclusions. Those are first conclusions, so they are not made. I mean, probably I can change in a few months. So, but the idea is that even though we use a more structural way to think about future, or maybe the scenarios, the idea is that the future is consistently narrated as in close continuity with the present. So if we read all these narratives, it's very close to our days. So it's unfortunately that happened, but they imagine the future or the AI. They imagine those futures where the AI either repair the social problems of the present, or they intensificate the scenario, the problems that we see in the present. So this is one of the main conclusions. So the second one, it's more about this hegemonic view that we talked before, that is based on these dominant assumptions like order, efficient, security, control. So the thing is to show how difficult it is to envision the future, and also to move beyond these present-centered projections to sustain a more plural and different futures, different vision of the future. So yeah, so I'm going to pass the word to Lorenzo, so they talk about. So he's talking about the study case number 2, which is part of his research.
All right. Thank you, Leandro.
So the study case 2 is similar but a bit different from the activity that Leandro presented, and is partly connected to the work of my PhD, even though the presentation I will give today comes from a study that we made in January and February of this year. So it's only like 3-4 months ago. And the main title is The Role of Scenarios to Deal with Climate Change. Now, this work was made in collaboration with 2 colleagues of mine that are now both teachers. One is Francesco, that was also a PhD with me in the same research group of Olivia, that also did a PhD in physics education and now teaches physics and mathematics in Bologna High School. And the third one is a colleague that just finished a PhD in modern languages, literatures, and cultures, specifically studying on the role of eco-dystopias in Hispano-American countries. So she spent more than a year in Mexico working with immigrants and people moving from towards the frontier. Also, she's been in Chile to work specifically in the narratives and how people describe the futures, how they depict the future. So this broad collaboration brought us to change a course that was already been made twice. That is the course called Towards New Future Scenarios, the role of physics in dealing with the challenges of climate change. That is the same course that I presented also last time. I had the opportunity to present my work here. So this is the third iteration of the course, but it's different from the others. I will explain why. Now, the main structure is quite similar. So we always start with the introduction to climate change and climatology to move towards the concept of uncertainty in physics, the uncertainty in climate change, and why we need to embrace a futures-oriented practice in order to deal with the uncertainties of climate change. But then we open more on the concept of scenarios, not just in science, but also in literature with the approach from Federica. We moved the gameplay, instead of doing in the last lesson, as in the last implementations, we did it on the fifth meeting of this course. And I will explain now in detail all these things. And then in the last session, we devoted a full 3 hours to the activity of scenarios writing, to conduct a causal analysis and then to make a discussion. The people that participated in this study are roughly like 25 students on the last years of high school. So in Italy is like 13 years of school, so it's the 11th, 12th, and 13th grades. There would be people from 16 to 19 years old, just to be clear. The structure was 6 lessons of 3 hours each, and of course it moves between physics education, climatology, but also literature. Now, one of the main outcomes of this course was a game that I already presented here last time, but just for the people that were not present. It's called Futures. It's an activity, as a scenario making activity, that we created together with Francesco in the first implementation of the course, that basically asks players to imagine how the future might be if we change the ways in which we produce energy, the ways in which we deal with other aspects of, for example, transportation, electrification, the reforestation, all this kind of stuff. And the games is played in this way. So there are 3 rounds. Usually 6 players play all together in a collaborative way. They have to play through different timelines, let's say. They use a simulator called the En-ROADS simulator produced by MIT, quite famous in the field of climate decision making. And they have to deal with the wildcards. Wildcards are basically scenarios that they can deal with that are connected to the different types of uncertainties that we can have in climate change. And they have to divide themselves between the different categories of this simulator. Therefore, each person works on a specific area. These areas are conventional sources of energy, emission control, green areas, energy efficiency, electrification, and green energy. Now, the main aim of this game is to reach by 2100 the goal of the Paris Agreement. That would be to stay under the 2.0 raise in temperature with respect to pre-industrial times, better if it is 1.5. And then what are the main objectives, like the real objectives of the activity from an educational perspective, is to simulate a futures-oriented policy-making process. That is why the simulator was built in the first place. And then to deal with the complexities and uncertainties of environmental, economic, and social aspects of climate change. Now, what is the most important part of this implementation? Why am I talking about this particular implementation today? Is that we didn't just finish our course with the game, but we wanted to critically explore what type of scenarios were created by the students through the game. To do this, we posed these questions. How can we explore the scenarios created by the students, but also how can we problematize and describe the type of words that they created? So what we did was to divide the work in 3 phases. Specifically, this is like some of the instructions we gave to the students to do this activity all together in the last lesson of the course. First of all, we wanted them to be able to represent what we call the critical map of a scenario. Coming from this image specifically comes from the field of detection and attribution of extreme events in climate change, and is an approach called the storyline approach that aims at distinguishing between the different causes and factors that motivates a specific extreme event. So for example, a landslide is not just a landslide, but it's something that is connected to all the different aspects of climate. Of course, there are some things that are more important or more like bigger, and other things that are just connected to the specificity of the thing happening. So in this way, mapping is not just a linear map, but it's a sort of causal map. So what we'd ask to the students in the first phase was to review all the actions that they that emerged during the game, so all the things they did, to identify causes, effects, and relationships between the various actions and decisions, and also to organize these elements into a causal map or diagram. So this first step was analytical, but in a way that would make them able to represent the type of word they created, or at least the logic structure of this word. The second step is a sort of a critical analysis of this. I use this image that I like a lot. It's called A Never-Ending Loop of Thoughts from Hidenori Ikeda and Saiko Ito. That shows the difficulty in mapping the complexity of things. Because of course, like moving from this type of map that is, quite linear, quite simple, to something like this, we actually have to go through a complexification of reality, where all the assumptions that we think we have are actually usually put aside in place of the real complexity of things. So in the second phase, we ask the students to take a critical look at the diagram they drawn up and to think about how the initial actions actually led to certain consequences. Because what is one of the main results of this game is that even when people start with the best idea about their desirable futures, they end up creating some sort of dystopias. And they do not realize this until the very end. So the main problem is, okay, now when things started to go wrong, let's say, okay? So this is like all the process. And then we ask them to consider whether the diagram highlights linear or circular relationships, or predictable or unexpected ones. Basically, like this is an activity that helps them in perceive the inner complexity of the problem. This phenomenon, this process, we call them process of reality shock. So basically, the process of realizing the complexity of the society we live in. That is not just linear, simple. I do A and I expect B, but usually is I have A and I expect Z or something. But between A and Z, there were like so many passages that we cannot even realize. So the third phase from this was this image is taken from the IPCC and specifically from one of the last reports, 2022, and it represents the process of moving between possible alternatives, but specifically it identifies those points that we, in our case, we call critical moments. Usually in climate change, they're called tipping points, that are the points of non-return. That means the things that once you go through, you cannot go back to other possibilities. They define the type of world you have. So what we did was we tried to ask our students, okay, now that you have your complex map of how things evolved during the activity, are you able to identify those critical moments in the system when small changes have had significant effects or where the system has become unstable? That means if you had like your desirable idea at first, and then you started to build your own scenario, and you ended up with a dystopia, in which exact moment or which specific event led to the construction of that specific dystopia? And this was a really interesting process, because like for them it was, of course, this is a difficult activity, and for them it was quite difficult to actually identify these specific critical moments. But we asked also another thing, that is actually the moment in which we asked them to create the scenario. So once they identified these critical moments, what we asked them was to prepare a brief written explanation and small scenario that would describe the, we can call it the uchronia, the what if. So once you identify the critical moment of your scenario, when things started to go wrong, we asked them, okay, what type of future would you instead build? What type of scenario would you instead want, starting from that critical moment, that detaches from the actual scenario that you created through the game? No? So this was the main activity, like the what if activity. And even if we only actually gave them, in this point, I think it was 1.5 hours to do this scenario, what emerged was something super interesting. So in the last lesson, there were like almost 20 people, and they produced 8 to 9 scenarios. They were like only like 1 page, half page long, not really long, but they were very different one to another from a narrative perspective. So in this, Federica helped a lot in giving them instruments and hints on possible ways. For example, like how to build a story, who's going to be the main protagonist, what type of events are unfolding. But all this kind of style, we've seen before that the scenarios have this narrative style, were based on the practical exercise that they did before. So it was all connected. And in these scenarios that I now present only some sort of brief analysis, but they were really interesting. For example, there was one in which Mother Nature was talking directly to the people, addressing them. So it was saying, like she was saying, all right, I really understand why you want to go on with this ecological transition. It's more productive, it's more useful for us, but don't forget that I exist. Don't forget that we are all together. Don't forget that we need to cooperate in order to build a future for everybody. Or for example, there was another scenario in which students imagined a specific religious group that would lead all the others to salvation. There was one in which scientists would take the lead. In another one, people would completely destroy the economy. There was a post-war scenario in which people imagined that only Switzerland was existing, and the main problem was how to obtain a new chocolate, for example. Like some of them were fun, some of them were like more critic, but it was really interesting because like we had all this round of presentations at the end in which each of them could actually see the alternative scenarios they created. And this gives back this idea of multiple futures that we can have in front of us, you know. So just to briefly present more, let's say, analytic analysis of this implementation, almost all of them imagine futures that were shaped by some sort of systemic disruption. So none of them imagine like, oh yeah, the future is really nice, we just continue with this. Almost all the scenarios had something really bad happening at one point and a future that would evolve from that specific thing happening. For example, there would be a sort of climate breakdown, scarcity of resources, ecological loss, war, migrations, or institutional failures. All the scenarios were informed by one of these main things. But the most important part of these scenarios is not just what happened, but how the student imagined a possible, things happening after this. So what happened after this main disruption? It's not just there's no future, but there is a future that is different from what we imagine. Now, all these things were described by these four main characters. So first of all, there is a lot of intersectionality. So climate change is the dominant background, of course, because the main topic of the course, but intersects with other crises like the war, food insecurity, economic collapse, loss of biodiversity. There is a general distrust in institutions. Several scenarios portray institutions, corporations, or political powers as unable, unwilling, or too self-interest to prevent collapse. And this says a lot about the feeling of this new generation that's coming. Warning about the future. That is, the future is often addressed through a warning structure. Messages to future generations, testimonies are for catastrophe, or appeals to those that are in power at the moment. And then also some sort of diagnostic futures. Therefore, students use these imagined futures to make visible present-day anxieties about ecological degradation, technological choices, economic interest, and political responsibility. So these kind of scenarios, as also Leandro noticed, were some sort of extending of the present anxiety. So I portray my present anxieties to the future, and the future is shaped by this kind of anxieties. This is a result that is really known in research, also from Jim Dator, one of the main names in future studies. But it gives back also the type of reading that the students have of the future at the moment. And what is interesting to say? It is interesting to say that these scenarios show that students are not just imagining the future as an abstract time ahead, but they are using the future as a lens to interpret the fragility of current socio-ecological systems. And now, last slide, how we can use the scenarios as tools for critically looking at our society. So the students used the scenario in a very interesting way, as I was saying before, and they used it for developing a critical imagination. Now, all these scenarios have a strong future orientation. They are explicitly located in future datist or post-crisis worlds. They have a rich narrative forms. There is, as I was saying, the forest testimony, space archive, religious proclamation, like many ways in which we can talk about the futures. There is a clear engagement with external drivers that are really part of the scenario. So it's not just ideas, but it seems that the students really took the contents of the course and put them into these scenarios. There is a strong ethical imagination, and I think this is one of the most important parts. So students use scenarios to ask questions about responsibility, justice, survival, and intergenerational consequences, mostly searching for a life to be lived. Most of them talked about a future in which we would value the well-being of people rather than just our economic gain, for example. And then there is a high comparative variety, like all these scenarios were very different from each other, even though they were starting from almost the same gameplays. Therefore, what we can learn from an educational perspective is that the educational value is not only in whether the scenarios are realistic, but in how they reveal students' ways of connecting scientific issues with social, political, and ethical consequences. That most times is something that in scientific teaching and science education is lacking, like this connection between the scientific part and all the things that are around. Therefore, this is where scenario work becomes useful for futures-oriented science education. That was the study. And to conclude, I always like to quote Jim Dator, like one of the most important people in the future studies field, that says that any useful idea about the futures should appear to be ridiculous. And why this? Because basically, if we imagine a future scenario that is really similar or that we feel really close to it, usually we are just replicating the present. We are just replicating the main narrative that shapes our present. So this would be the main task of pushing new generations to also appear ridiculous in order to think for a better future. That was it. Thank you very much. Okay, so yeah. if you have questions, please.
Thank you, Lorenzo, Leandro. It was a good lecture of both of you. And thank you for sharing your results, your ideas, and your research. I can start with a question, and we can go about this. Something that you said in the beginning of your presentation, it's something like studying the future to influence the present. And I don't know, when we are trying to do this in science education, I think there is a gap or a distance between what we can project of the future, like desirable futures, and how the students can bring this to their own lives. I mean, when we are studying future studies in science education, you said also that it was something like a policy-oriented framework, but it seems to me that the students have some difficulties to engage, to know the difference about what we should do from what we could do in the present. I mean, maybe there are difficulties to the students bring this, what they learn in the classroom with the other students, with the teachers, when we are projecting the future, what we want to build to the future, and the real life they are engaged of. So, I mean, how can we transpass this gap? Like, how can we bring something not in an idealistic way or a nihilistic way of seeing the present, and how can we bring the future not just as a didactic resource to do in the classroom, but how can we make this a real engagement on the student's life? I don't know if
I got it. This is one of the most central questions that we can ask and should ask as educators and science educators. I asked these questions many times also when I did my research, still today, on how we can actually influence somehow the way in which people use the knowledge that we bring them, like in classes. I think this is really connected to the idea that we have of science and the type of values that we pass from science. So usually, also in the mostly European narrative of the 18th, 19th century, like post-Illuminism, science and rationality were always put at the center of making decisions. So basically, science always used as a way to manage, to control the problems that we have in our life. Therefore, more knowledge brings more control about what we have. This is a really particular perspective that I think has many problems, just starting from the concept of control. That is something that brings back some sort of patriarchal type of reasoning. But from my perspective, science is not just this. I mean, science is also this, because of course, we want to know how technology works. We want to know if, as we were also discussing in the group, if the fly can go well or wrong. I need to trust, so I need to have some control over some things. But in the scientific education process, I think the most important part is to share the value of how we can actually apply the critical practices that we have in science to our everyday world. Therefore, it doesn't mean to imagine strange technology for the future or how, with the scientific research, we can solve all the problems. But mostly, what I try to pass to the people I usually teach is the fact that we can apply the scientific type of critical analysis of problems to our everyday lives in order to be able to navigate the complexity and to deal with the uncertainties that we have. Therefore, first of all, there is the whole process of trying to understand what type of words you have in front of you, what type of problem. Is this a simple problem? Is this a complex problem? Is this something that can be easily solved? Or is this something that we cannot do anything about it? Already like distinguishing these levels helps in trying to understand how we can actually act after. And then from this first step, trying to understand what type of ways we can use to deal with these problems is something that is necessary. About the policy-oriented aspects, I think that this is what usually like the concept of collective agency. When we want to bring agency to students, like to develop these kind of things, to develop some sort of collectiveness of this process. Therefore, not just an individual agency, what can I do? But what can we do as group of people, as people that share the same ethical values, for example. Therefore, after an activity like the one that we did in our class, if I had more time, for example, what I would have loved to do was to stay there and to collectively reason on how many different possibilities of futures there were. Or for example, on the type of main ethical aspects that they were sharing during their scenario activity. So all these kind of practices can actually help in changing the way in which we perceive science, specifically like in our context. It's not just like this in all the world, luckily. And similarly, to bring home the type of reasoning more than the processes or the results. It's more just how we approach the problems that shape our capability of dealing with them. I don't know if I answered you, but this is like the way in which I try to deal with the science education. Yeah.
I don't know if Leandro wanted to add.
Yeah, I completely agree with Lorenzo, and yeah, in my point of view, also this idea of scenario planning, it's for me, it's a way to also to escape the idea that science will resolve everything, that we are just we just react to the change, not to somehow we can think that we can shape the future. It's it's a very complicated relation, but I think that I completely agree with Lorenzo said, but for me, I think it also has this kind of relationship on how we have problems and problems related to science development or the technological development, but we still think that science somehow will resolve. And I think that the scenario planning activity, it's a way to think, okay, maybe science is not the best way to resolve the things, but what I should do, what can I make to have a better future?
We have a question on YouTube. In which degree do you think that the scenarios are dependent from the question proposed, AI, climate change? I mean, when we look for society, many controversial trends appear. So if the question could be different, like the future of games or soccer or school, do you think this future is also will appear very disruptive? And which degree could have occurrence in them? Futures are different. Could we believe that the students really have a negative vision of future, or they just express that due to the activity and the common expectation of that?
Leandro, would you like to go first, or can I go?
Yeah, you can go. So
Okay. So, of course, the type of result is always connected to the type of organization of the activity. This is something that is quite, would be really non-pragmatic thing to think that they just think this apart from how the activity was organized or how the course was developed. What is interesting in our case is that although this is the third implementation of the course, and the game was played also with many people at this point, I was counting the other day, I was thinking more than 300 people played this activity through the last 3 years. The type of results are always similar. And there are some trends that can be seen in how young generations perceive the futures. Therefore, I wouldn't say that all of them have negative visions. There are some people that are good with the type of future there is now. Or sometimes, like in literature, it is possible to see this double reading. So basically, like usually they perceive their future as positive, as good, as something that can go towards the direction they want, while at the same time, the rest of society will go towards collapse. This is also quite based on our capability of believing in others, believing in our systems. Like we live in a world right now that has a lot of complexities, and it's not so easy to believe that people are acting for the good. So usually we are brought to imagine that other people doesn't have the same moral standard, the same ethical values as ourselves. There was a recent study on Nature that showed this in 2024. Therefore, like there is like this general trend where there is not much trust about how things could evolve. Maybe a possible type of activity that something that I was thinking about recently would be to have like some sort of double type of scenario building. One that can be more self-oriented, and instead another that can be collective-oriented, society-oriented. Therefore, the scenario I imagine for myself in the future, and at the same time, another scenario that I imagine for other people. In this way, when you then start to share this type of results in the same class, for example, as I was saying before, like people start to realize that they're not just the only ones that aim for a better future, but that there is a collective idea of how we can shape things. And this is also at the basis of the future workshops, that is the workshops made by some super important person in the future studies called Robert Jung in 1950s, 60s, and 70s in Germany, where they started to build these activities made for society to reshape their specific communities. And it was mostly an activity where you start to put people together and they start to share all their issues and problems. And when you realize that the issues are shared with the others, you also start to think that there is a possible way to deal with them collectively. So like this process can be something that maybe changes the way in which people react to this type of activities. So not just a disruptive phase, but also a constructive phase in which we declare that there is, okay, things will go bad, but we can make them go less bad, let's say. Leandro?
Yeah, I agree with Lorenzo. And in my case, I think disruption is a very strong word. Even though me and Lorenzo, we work with different techniques, we realize that we have similar results when we discuss about future, when we these aspects that future is very related to the present. I think that when we have to think about disruption, maybe we can have to have a more, we need a better preparation for students to think about all these disruptions and all these alternative, very, I don't know, not mainstream futures that is positive or negative. But yeah, I think that we can work in some different constructions of the future. So we need to think also that future is very related to art. So there are different ways to envision the future. So I think that's maybe is the way to relate to the disruption thing. I don't know yet.
Thank you. There is one more question. We are just waiting to download, but there is only one more. Alguém?
Thank you, Leandro and Lorenzo, for the presentation. I don't know if I will be able to express myself in my ideas, but I think my question is quite similar to what Gabriel asked, but I would like to make it in a different way, because I think that you both choose themes that are very interesting, climate change and AI. And I think these subjects are really important, but they are very big and difficult to talk about, to understand about. And I think the role of the students, when they try, first of all, understand what is AI, what is climate change, and then to understand the implications of the developments of these problems in their life. And I would like to ask about the scale. If you think in local forms to understand these problems in their life, and when we think in a collective way, because it's not possible we solve these problems or think about them in a future that these problems won't exist. In the same way, we ask to students to think about this, and I think the emotions have an important place in these futures that they can imagine, and we see this in the narratives that you present to us. So I would like to ask about the scale, because I think it's not possible we expect that the students think that what decisions that they can take and how the actions how they will orientate their actions. But I think that there is this problem about how we treat the scales, because we can think about a child and they usually say, oh, I can't throw my garbage in the street because this will be bad to nature. Kids think like this. In a certain way, they are imagining about the whole planet and etc. But the age of the students that you were researching is not like this kind of answers. So I would like to ask if you thought about this, and if we can talk about climate change like really in a global sense always, but think in the more in a smaller way. I don't know if it made sense.
I think I got the idea of the question. Leandro, would you like to go first?
Yeah, I think maybe it depends on the question. What we envision as the focal question that you want to use as this question, the main question for the scenario building, because I think that if we take a broader action. I don't know if it's the right word, but I think if you think more globally, I think it's more difficult to build the scenarios. Comparing with a more local or a more, I don't know, a more locally scenario. I don't know. in my experience with the scenario planning activity, when we restrict the place, the duration of the planning, the scenario planning, I think it's more relatable to the person, and I think that somehow can make a more reflective way to think about future. I don't know what's Lorenzo's expertise with this activity, but I don't know. For me, I think that depends on the question, and more close to the person, more she can, more the person can reflect about the issue.
I agree with what Leandro said, but I would like to complexify a bit. In the case, I will talk about climate change, because this is my expertise, even though like one of the main problems is that there is no expertise in climate change. Therefore, like it's somebody framed the concept of hyperobject to describe climate change. I don't know if you know about this term. Hyperobject is something that cannot be defined by dimensions. For example, like if you think about what are the dimensions of the universe, we don't know. You know, where does it end? You know, it's something that is everywhere. Climate change is something similar. The climate crisis is something similar. Therefore, there is no expertise, there is no solution, there is no way in which we can simply deal with the problem. And this is something that needs to be stated very early. Now, when we deal with these things, all the same time, in a field that I studied while I was in Southampton, that is called the disaster education. For example, they use the concept of distance with respect to the topic that you're studying. In climate change, there are 4 levels of distance. That is, first one is called spatial distance. No, sorry, the first one is hypothetical distance. That is the distance that you have towards the very concept. So for climate change would be, do I believe that climate change exists? No. Some people say it doesn't exist. I don't care. Okay. Many people say this, but not so many actually in the world. Not so many, luckily. Then there is a second level that is the temporal distance. And people say, okay, I believe that these things exist, but will be in the future. It's not a problem of today. A third level is the spatial distance that says, okay, this thing is happening right now, but it's far from me, okay? And we actually do this many times. Yeah, there is climate change, you know, but it's in, I don't know, I will just say random places in the world, but I don't know, like, yeah, the Philippines are feeling this, and yeah, the Amazon forest, like, you know, these broad concepts, like, you know, things are happening there when actually it's happening everywhere, but we tend to do this distance. And then there is a fourth level that is one of the most dangerous, that is also has some sort of racism behind, that is the social distance. When we think that things are happening, so they exist. They exist right now, they exist right here, but they do not affect us. They affect other people. Yeah, okay, there is a huge heat wave. Yeah, but I am in my special room with my AC, and this doesn't affect me, no? Now, in the context of climate change, why this is important? Because, for example, there was a super interesting sentence that they used during the Los Angeles wildfires 2 years ago, when they almost destroyed all the city. It became big news because it was Los Angeles, like these things happens everywhere all the time. But many people on social networks started to share the sentence that said, climate change is something that gets closer and closer to you, and you see it through social media until you are the person that is filming the problem, you know? And for them it was strange, because, you know, it was happening right there, something that usually, it doesn't exist, it was happening right there. So why this is relevant for climate change, and to actually talk with the people to make them reason about the scale of the problem is that students, from literature, this is quite evident, they need to have things that are closer to them in order to care about the issue. And this happens to all of us, basically, on different levels, but we need to have things close to us in order to actually care about it. At the same time, to care about something is not enough. We also need something that is quite disruptive, that makes us understand that things are different from what we expected. So for example, in our case with the students, we always start with their experience, their direct experience with climate change, and usually is an extreme event. For example, a big flood. In Bologna, we had many in the last 3-4 years in the very city. It can be a big flood, it can be like how they feel the heat waves, or for example, many students shared on how they used to go skiing in the winter, and now this window of the snow, it gets closer and closer. So basically, like, we start from there. So we start from something that is really close to them, so that they can relate. Then we need to open to the big complexity of the issue, so to let them understand, all right, this is how you feel the problem, but this problem is everywhere, and it's super huge to deal with. The main idea is that we will not solve it, but we need to understand first the main structure of the issue. Therefore, all the science comes handy, because it can give you the instruments to rationalize and model the problem. And starting from there, you have to understand the implications. Because therefore, I don't know, switching to electric batteries is not a solution. It's a shift of the problem. If you don't frame this problem properly, you're not able to then understand how to act. Therefore, like, start from small, open to the complexity, stay in the complexity, and then staying in the complexity, trying to bring back to your own present the type of decisions that you can make in order to direct your personal future. And it can be just recycling, it can be. But maybe it can be also, I will try to talk with my family in order to make them understand that this practice is not good. Or for example, if people have more, I don't know, they're a bit older, like in our case, people started to vote, because like in Italy, we start to vote after 18. In Brazil, it's 16, right? Yeah. So like in the last year, they start to vote. So like they have, this space. And usually what they say, this is the last thing to answer your question, the main instruments that we can have to deal with the climate crisis are our electoral, in Italian is scheda, I don't know is in English, like the electoral card that you go to vote with. So your possibility to vote, and also your credit card. Where do you put your money in? So for example, having, I don't know, money in a bank that allows all this type of activities, extractive activities, we can avoid. These are all big actions that when you do it like by yourself, you feel, oh, I'm doing nothing, I'm too small. But when you build the collective awareness of how powerful a small group can be, then things start to change. Of course, this can be ideological, can be naive, but from my perspective, is the only way in which we can deal with such hyper objects, to unpack and understand the inner complexity, and then to stay in the complexity. Sorry for the long question, but it was a super important question.
Thank you. We have another question from YouTube. We are living in times of incredible futures in all sorts of ways. There seems to be no limit to what might happen. Who would have imagined a pandemic? The same seems to be true about climate change or AI. This seems to leave everyone a bit speechless, to the point of paralyzing them because they have absolutely no idea what to do. This could be a problem for education. How can we deal with this and turn reflection on future into something that can be accessed and acted upon?
Yeah, this is also like big questions day. Working with I will just start, Leandro, sorry, and then I give you the mic. Working, for example, with people coming from the literature field, what we know is that one of the main problems of the climate crisis, in this case, but it also relates to the other huge questions like the pandemics or AI revolution, is the fact that we are not able to build an imaginary that differs from the standards. Federica, in her thesis, that is super amazing, actually shared this about how the use of the common use of dystopias, for example, in the broad fiction world, usually bring us to the idea that there is no possible alternative, or there is no positive alternative. So usually this lack of imaginary also is a lack of capability of imagination, rather than just like understanding the solution. And when we go through that process, that is almost everywhere in television, because it's always easier to attract people when you build like a huge dystopian movies instead of just building I don't know, collective shared social future in which we are all together and we try to deal with the complexity. Like the big word is more interesting. So the way in which we can deal with this is starting to open the imaginary. So like to remind to the people that we deal with that the future is not one. So all the things about future studies, the future is not one. There are many possible futures. And as my personal, the work I would like to do in the next years is to reinforce the idea that these futures already exist and they are just elsewhere. So usually in physics, we are used to consider the light cone, in special relativity, when we distinguish between events that are time like or distance like, space like. Usually we are only focused on our single future. So like a cone, starts from a small point and it brings back like the imaginaries. But the point is that there are so many points all around, so many presents at the moment, not just futures but presents. Therefore, the main task is to connect with them, to learn from them, not just to bring them to your reality, because this doesn't work, but to be open to the other realities. So not just one present, but many presents that can help us in imagining many futures. So only in this way we can actually be able to give the tools to be positive about what could happen. Yeah. Leandro?
Yeah, I agree with Lorenzo, and I think that the pandemic is a very interesting point that we can also say it's a wild card in some sense. That it's these small events that change everything, change the way we live today. And I think that maybe, I don't know if you can imagine the future without these, the COVID-19 pandemics. I don't know how it should be, how it might be this future, now this present. I think that those are very important to understand how the future might be like. If you think, for example, I think it's the 19th century when they developed I think it's H.G. Wells wrote the From Earth to the Moon, for example. People had no expectation that somehow the man would reach the moon, and basically 100 years later, so the man reached the moon. So I think it's an exercise to speculation. Yeah, I think that's those. We are only speculating how the future might be like in climate change. We are speculating how the future might be like with artificial intelligence, and we are also can think how the future might be like with, I don't know, a different pandemic, I don't know, another different events that might somehow shape the future. So the idea is to be prepared to these speculated futures.
Thank you.
Yeah, okay. I think we are done with the questions.
So yes.
So thank you very much, Lorenzo and Leandro, for this very rich time discussion. And hope to see you all in the next open meeting on the August, I think. On June we are. In July we will have not the meeting, so we can meet again on August. Okay, so thank you very much again.
Thank you all.
Thank you.